Metro Louisville is made up of 26 districts. This podcast gives you a chance to connect with your council member and learn about what's going down in your district. Welcome back to District Download. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I am Katrina Helmer. Joining me is now a podcast pro, Councilman Marcus Winkler. I just saw a little laugh and a little shake of the shoulders when I said that. But thank you for joining us. This is a fun one. This is the last one of the year.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So with it being the last one of the year, kind of had the opportunity to brainstorm a little bit about what you wanted to talk about. The last episode you had was really engaging, learned something very specific, very unique about a project going on in Metro Louisville. Now we kind of want to talk some practical advice to people, provide some education, but planning and zoning. And I want to preface that. Some people might hear some of those words and automatically tune out. These are not tune-out words. These are actually very important topics. So why don't we just hit it right from the start? Why is this important? Why do we want to talk about this today?
Well, I think planning and zoning, first of all, makes up the majority of the work on council. So if you look at just sort of the sheer volume of what we do, it is probably the single largest line item on any agenda. It also tends to be the item that stirs up the most passion and controversy from folks in the community. So I think it's very important to understand the process. It can be a process that's confusing. There are lots of designations and codes and different things can be built in different categories. We won't go into all that depth today. We'll probably just hit the highlights. But I think it is, people are concerned about what gets built in their neighborhoods, and this is the process that authorizes or denies that sort of development.
And there's also a point to, a lot of times, I think, people feel like they find out about something once it's already too late or everything has been decided. But there are points along the way, and I think that's what we want to talk about today, of this is when you have the platform to get involved, and this is when you want to be knowledgeable. So with that, why don't you go ahead and introduce who is our wonderful guest we have at the table with us.
Brian Davis from Planning and Design Services, who is also a District 17 resident.
That is correct. Yes, good morning.
Good morning. All right. Well, thank you for joining us because we're now about to grill you with questions. So why don't we go ahead and start with the big picture? What is this process for, and what are some of the steps that have to be met?
Sure. So the Office of Planning and Design Services, what we do is we oversee a number of applications that come in for the Planning Commission, as well as the Board of Zoning Adjustment, and then the Landmarks Commission. And so the staff within our office, again, we oversee the applications and kind of guide those through the process. We're here today to talk specifically about planning and zoning. And so from a zoning standpoint, what we do is we provide case managers who oversee the distribution of that to the metro agencies who are also reviewing these plans. And then the case managers serve as a point of contact for the public and Metro Council reps, anyone who has any kind of questions about the proposals that are going forward.
So let's maybe talk about this. Let's create an example.
Sure.
A faux example, and what would be the first step for some development or some project coming into, let's say, your district?
Sure, and so frequently what we deal with is someone is either in the process of acquiring a property, or they have a property where they're wanting to change the zoning so they can do a certain use. And so, say for example, you have a property that's zoned for a residential use, and they're wanting to go to a commercial. We'll keep it very generic here. Usually, what happens is that person will contact our office and say, "Hey, I'd like to rezone my property. How do I go about this?" And so we give them a general overview of what it is that they need to do. Those steps include developing a draft site plan so that we know what they're planning on doing with the site. So if they're proposing to tear down a building and construct a new one or something like that, that's all things that we look at. We let them know about the entire public process. And so the first step in that is where they actually submit a pre-application to us, and then after they submit that pre-application, they are required to notify adjoining property owners so that those people are aware of the proposed rezoning. And the purpose for that is really to give the neighbors a chance to find out early on about what someone is proposing, so that if they do have questions or they do have suggestions, then they can have that one-on-one dialogue with the applicant and hopefully resolve some of those questions before it gets further down the road, when people start to get kind of panicky when they start receiving official public hearing notices and things like that.
And maybe we should also set just why things have to be rezoned. This is the concept of a residential neighborhood, and there's purposes and reasons why those properties are residential, instead of someone just saying, well, I own this property and now I want to build this, megalith whatever in the middle of someone's backyard. So maybe let's set the tone there too.
Yeah, so every piece of property in the county, and I'd imagine really in the country, is zoned for a certain type of land use, right? And that exists, either it was set at some point in time or it's been rezoned at some point in the past. And whatever that property is zoned for is what establishes what can be built on it within the parameters of the Land Development Code. To your point, I think good planning groups things like residential areas together. Then typically there'd be a buffer zone of something like commercial, lighter use commercial, and then you move to heavier use industrial, so that you don't have industrial developments right next to somebody's house. There's sort of a transition zone, right? But you have, and also that all of your commercial zones aren't 50 miles from where people live, right? So you want a good mix, you want good planning. But within each of those categories, you can have very different types of development. So for example, commercial zoning might also include things like apartments. So it's not so clear cut to say, well, commercial, that's exclusively going to be retail establishments, right? There are broad things that cover those. There's also types, particularly if you look at lots of new sort of urban design, where you might have mixed use developments where there might be first floor retail and then residential on top. And I think, ultimately what the Land Development Code seeks to do is have a good mix of options. You want single family, apartments, maybe patio home communities. You want diversity of housing in an area. You don't want them all to be one type. Same thing with commercial, and then same thing with industrial. And you want to have appropriate buffer zones between those.
So with that kind of overview, explanation of why these things are being done, some of the first steps, some of the first input people can have, and I think that's what we want to drill down into, is how can I get involved before something is, quote, too late. So in those first steps, how is someone involved, or a neighborhood or general, just Joe Schmo, how do they get involved?
Right. So when we receive an application each week, we send out a big list of everything that has been submitted for that week. And I know that that's tough for people to sit down and go through every week because there is a lot of information there, and it covers the entire metro area. Now, what they can do is they can sign up for notifications specific to their Metro Council district. And so, if you live in Metro Council District 17 or whichever, you can go to the LouisvilleKY.gov website. Not only can you receive notifications from the Metro Council rep, because a lot of times they pass along that information, you can receive notices specifically from Planning and Design Services about new developments in your Metro Council district.
I loved those. I was signed up for them for a very long time, even before I came to Metro Council. And that's how I kept track of a lot of these. But you are right. It's hard to read and translate those sometimes.
Yeah, and one thing I'd add is it's important, particularly if you live near the border of a council district, you might also want to sign up for the neighboring council districts, because if you're living, for example, in my area, if you live near the Brownsboro Road corridor, which is really the demarcation line between District 17 and District 16, you're probably more impacted by things that happen just north of Brownsboro Road than you are things that happen in the southernmost part of my district in Middletown, for example, right? So making sure that you're not just signing up for the district where you live, but also the neighboring areas might be a best practice, because you're going to be equally impacted or more so impacted by something that just happens to be across the district line.
Exactly. Yeah, and those notices include the address of the property for which the person is proposing to make this change. And so we try to keep the neighborhood notices fairly simple so that people, again, they can look and see where it is. They can quickly determine, oh, this is near me. It could have an impact. And then our planning and design case manager is always listed on those notices. And so if they have any questions, they can either reach out directly to the developer or they can contact our office, and we're happy to answer any questions that they may have.
And I like that those notices have links. And so then you can click through that and not just see, this notice sign. It gives you a little bit more information than when you're going through.
Right, and that's something that came out of the pandemic, because previously it was just a letter saying, be here at this location on this date to find out more. And then during the pandemic, we expanded the information that was required for these neighborhood notices. We got some really good feedback about that, and so we decided to make that a requirement for all notices going forward.
So that's kind of someone's first insight into, hey, this pre-application has been filed. We have some idea of the idea that could be going in here. What's then that next step? What happens next?
Sure. So during the pre-application review, again, the case manager is reviewing the proposal against the Land Development Code and then our comprehensive plan, Plan 2040. And then we are also coordinating reviews with other agencies such as Metropolitan Sewer District, Public Works. If it's on a state route, we send notices to the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet, all the utility companies that are in town. And so everyone's taking a look at that plan and determining what changes, if any, may be needed to facilitate that development on that property.
So a lot more involved in checking, how does this impact not just any physical structures right around, but all of our infrastructure as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a key step that people often don't see. And, one of the questions that we get a lot of times is, why is this allowed to move forward? Why doesn't anybody have any input? And I think, one of the pieces of the law is a lot of that does happen on the front end. But the way that, Kentucky is a very property rights friendly state. And so as long as you are compliant with the law, the onus is going to be on the process moving forward, right? And so whether it's in a rezoning, assuming that it is compliant with Plan 2040, which is sort of the comprehensive plan for the city, these agencies will look to make sure that there's not any issues. For example, one that you might not consider is, if fire trucks have to have access and be able to turn in the parking lot so that, if there were an emergency situation, they can pull in, they can turn their trucks around. All those reviews happen on the front end. There is a point where, and I think Brian was getting ready to get to this, the neighborhood meeting where neighbors can weigh in and have a voice. But again, the things that prevent a development from moving forward are not, do I think it's a good idea or not, right? Do I like it or not? The things that keep a development from moving forward are whether they are compliant with the law or not. And so, maybe Brian, you can talk a little bit about sort of what those elements might be.
Sure. So you could have any number of things that we're looking at from a technical standpoint. So maybe sewer capacity is not available in that area. And so, or maybe the roads aren't built up to standards to handle any additional traffic that's being generated. And so those are all things that planning and design, as well as the other agencies, are looking at from a technical standpoint. From like a law standpoint, again, we're looking at the Land Development Code to make sure that everything on the plan is meeting the plan. Are they providing adequate buffers where they're needed? If not, then what potential waivers are they having to request in order to seek relief from those? So that's all things that we're looking at. And then Councilman Winkler mentioned the comp plan. We have checklists based on the location of the property and what their request is. And so we go through and do a comprehensive plan review for every zoning change that comes through. In that checklist, you can look through it and you can see literally checks or X's based on whether or not it meets these certain criteria, and then we use those to make our recommendations not to the applicant so that they know whether or not they want to move forward. Because if they have a project that they have a lot of X's, then they may want to reconsider that property or that use for that property, and they may not want to move forward.
Yeah, and I think it's important with the checklist, right? It's a guideline, it's not a requirement. And so it's not like the checklist has 11 categories and you've got if you've got 6 or more, you pass, and but if you've only got 5, you fail, right? It is a guiding document that helps advise your recommendations to the next step in the process, which is the Planning Commission.
Exactly, yes.
So let's go to the next step in the process then. What happens next?
Okay, sure. So the next step in the process, once the applicant has had they've submitted their pre-application, they've had their neighborhood meeting, now it's time for them to file their formal application. So again, they submit a plan to us. We distribute that to the agencies, and then everybody's taking a look at it to see how the plan may have changed since their initial comments. This is when, again, notice goes out like via PDS to say, hey, we've received a formal application now for this application. People who have signed up for that notification will receive that email notification. And then, we're working again to check over our comments, make sure that the plan has been changed. And then eventually what we get around to is the applicant being ready to move forward to public hearing. And so this is where we begin the series of public meetings where people, when they think about the Planning Commission, this is what they're thinking about, having to get up and come and attend a meeting and speak before people. And we always tell people we're there to listen. That's what we're there for. And so if they have concerns about projects, we want to hear about it. If they can't be at the meetings, then we encourage them to contact their case manager so that we can include emails and documents that they want to submit to the file in the case file, because that case file ultimately is like the big, large legal document that if something's in that case file, then it can be referred to later on down the road, whether it's in Metro Council or if it gets appealed, it goes to court, whatever. But yeah, coming back around, so we review that application. We give any kind of revision comments to the applicant, and then once the plan is ready, then we move forward with public hearings.
So these public hearings, this is kind of the meat and potatoes where, not just like your surrounding neighborhoods are getting noticed. This is where anyone can come, and you're saying, we want to hear what you have to say because this is the time for it.
Correct, yes.
Yeah, so if you kind of start to piece together the pieces that we've talked about, the neighborhood meeting is really more of an informal, give us some feedback, right? Non-binding. There's no decision that's made in the neighborhood meeting, but it is a way for a developer, for example, to say, here's what I'm thinking about. What do you all think? Okay. And then they can choose to take that feedback or not. But it is not, so it is an official event and it's required as part of the process, but there's no official decisions that are made there. The Planning Commission meeting is where the decision is actually made. And so that's where, when the public wants to weigh in on the process, that's, as Brian said, that's where you come speak. If you can't make the meeting, you can at least send in your comments. But basically that hearing is what creates the case file that ultimately decides whether a project is approved or denied. And that is what's then ultimately submitted to the next phase of the process, which is the Metro Council. Okay, and we'll get to that in just a minute.
So what do you say to the people who have the feeling that even though this public comment is built into the process, this whole process is tipped towards a developer. And even though I have my time to say what I want, it's not heard or it's not used.
So the first thing I'd say is I can certainly understand why that's the perspective, particularly when a significant portion of what comes to the Planning Commission ends up getting approved. I think there's a couple of reasons that maybe skews what actually is occurring. First of all, as Brian talked about all of the pre-work that happens, if a plan is not compliant with the law, it very rarely makes it to the Planning Commission. So you have an artificially high approval rate because the stuff that would get denied never even makes it
doesn't get to that point.
Exactly. Number two, as I mentioned, Kentucky is a property rights friendly state. And so if you meet the requirements in the plan, really the planning commission's job is basically to approve the plan. I mean, they are reviewing, making sure that the recommendations of staff comply with Plan 2040. And if they do, then again, the onus is on the planning commission to approve. So that can be why it seems that way. Now, I think where people get frustrated is sometimes they feel like they're not even heard or listened to in those meetings. And again, I think where the problem sometimes comes in is the arguments that people bring are not arguments that the planning commission can consider in their decision. Okay, so if I am arguing against a development, saying that I don't like it, or it brings too much density, unless you have proof for where it violates the comprehensive plan, those aren't really decision criteria. Okay, so if someone is going to argue against a development, looking for where it violates the plan, those are really the arguments that the planning commission could or should consider.
So then is the advice to people, when they're going through and they get notice, okay, something's coming around to my area, potentially, to go through, look at that, then how do they judge, not just like, oh, I don't like this, I don't want this here. How can they go ahead and, formally form their comments to go ahead and make those points of not just, I don't like it, but this is why this doesn't work?
Sure.
What would your advice be?
Yeah, my advice, whenever someone reaches out to me and says, hey, we've got this development coming, I've got concerns. I tell them, okay, we have to leave emotion out of it. Let's deal with facts, and let's deal with if it's a zoning case, let's deal with the comprehensive plan. So what elements of the comp plan do you feel the development is not meeting, and why? And so that would be the basis for the justification that someone would want to present at the planning commission hearing as to why they feel the application should be denied. So that is the number one thing. And it's difficult to argue for traffic. Now a lot of times they'll submit a traffic study that goes along with the zoning proposal. If you can read through that and kind of identify some of the things that they're saying in there, then you can you can reference that. But again, they're going to call you out for not being a traffic engineer if you're trying to say, I've lived here and I sit in traffic for three minutes trying to make a left turn out of my driveway every day. It's hard to put that in a way that the planning commission can then use that as justification for a denial. And so, again, got to leave emotion out and try to deal with facts and deal with the comprehensive plan as much as possible.
Yeah, I tell you, the things that I might look for specifically are, number one, in the staff report, we talked about the checklist. So if there are items that staff highlighted that it doesn't comply with, those would be potential areas to focus on, right? If the developer is asking for variances, they are asking for anything in the variances are reasons why I can't comply with the letter of the law. Okay, so those would be probably more salient points to argue and say, well, why should these points be enforced, right? But again, just saying I don't like it, probably not going to be a very compelling argument. And to the point Brian was making about the traffic study, I think number one, the traffic that people want to tolerate probably is much less than what the street's actual capacity is. And the engineer and the planning commission are using the street's capacity, not do I like sitting in traffic, right? And so I think the point that you're making is you've got a traffic engineer on one hand that has run a scientific study versus somebody that says, well, I don't believe the study, right? And so, if you're taking the emotion out of it and weighing that, are you going to give more credence to someone who has based their assessment, on proven techniques that are sort of based on industry standards, or somebody that says, well, I sit in my driveway for 3 minutes. And so in that case, the planning commission is probably going to give more weight to the traffic engineer. Now, again, if you can look at the study and say, well, here are areas where that study materially erred, okay, that might be a more compelling case. That's assuming that the traffic engineer is competent, that might be difficult to identify where they materially erred.
So we get through public comments. Then what happens? Where are we going next?
Yeah, so at the planning commission at the planning commission hearing, typically the planning commission makes a decision right there at that meeting, and so a lot of people feel that the planning commission's decision is final, and that is not the case. Louisville Metro, as well as the 12 other suburban cities, have zoning authority, and so what the planning commission is actually doing is making a recommendation to those bodies with zoning authority, and so. Once the planning commission holds their public hearing, they make their recommendation to we'll use Metro Council. Then that application comes over, and it is then Metro Council's purview to review the case file and everything that's in there. They can review the testimony. They can watch the planning commission meeting if they wish, and then they ultimately have a final decision over the zoning case.
Just to add to that, we have authority, but are also bound by the law, right? And so there's a couple of key pieces around the law that I think are important for people to understand. Number one, we are tasked with reviewing the case file, okay? And so we are prohibited from, at that point, taking additional outside things into consideration in our decision. And so the reason I bring that up is because a lot of times after the planning commission approves something, that's when we'll start to hear some from residents, right? Well, I'm opposed to this. I don't want to approve this. Those comments really can't be considered in the decision, okay? Because again, our job is to review the case file and the decision that the planning commission made. In a way, we are sort of, you might consider it like the court of appeals over the planning commission, because our job is to look at and say, did the planning commission properly apply the law in this case, right? Did they interpret the Plan 2040 correctly and arrive at the right decision? Not, do we just disagree, right? Because even if we choose to overturn the planning commission, we can't simply say, well, we don't like it, we want it denied. We actually have to essentially create an alternative case that says, well, the planning commission looked at these factors, we believe they erred, and here's the alternative findings of fact for why they erred. So it is sort of an assumptive burden on Metro Council versus just a straight yes or no, we like this or we don't like this. We actually have to prove alternatively. And again, we can only consider what's in the record when we're making that recommendation. So I bring that up because it's important, again, to highlight how important it is for the public to be involved in the planning commission phase, because that's ultimately the record that's going to be considered.
That's what I wanted to bring up as well, because the point to which I think a lot of people mistakenly get involved is then when it's up for vote. And those are the moments where there has been months, if not longer than that, the amount of work that has gone in to this. And like you were saying, there are things that you can and cannot take into consideration at a certain point. Do you want to just review that or take a moment on a soapbox to just make it very clear there are things that you can and cannot take into consideration as a council member?
Yeah, and I'd say it actually even goes beyond that. We're really prohibited from discussing pending zoning cases. And so, I know that gets very frustrating to the public. It's frustrating for us. When you go to a community meeting or a coffee meeting and people say, hey, I'm really, really concerned about this development, because we are sort of tasked with being that independent reviewer of the Planning Commission's decision, we have to be very careful to sort of prejudge a case, right? And say, if there is a risk, if you express an opinion prior to the case coming to us and say, oh yeah, this development is a terrible idea, I don't want it to move forward. Well, then if Metro Council ultimately reverses the Planning Commission decision and denies that case, you've basically created grounds for an appeal for the developer, because Metro Council is not the last step in the process. When a case is approved or denied, the aggrieved party has the ability to appeal that to the courts. So if we approve a development and people are opposed, they could sue and have it stopped in court, or vice versa. If we overturn a development, we could be sued and say that we erred. Now, if council is making comments before the case is for us to review, saying, hey, we're really opposed to this. There's no way this is going to move forward. We ultimately deny it. I think the applicant would have a pretty strong case in court to say, look, they didn't review what was in the record because they're already, in neighborhood meetings and on TV, months before they even saw the case and said they're not going to approve. I mean, what more proof do you want that they didn't follow just the case, which is their obligation under the law? And so that's why it's very difficult for us. We're prohibited from commenting on them. It does make it a challenge, right? Because, you're sitting across from a homeowner, you understand the concerns that they have, you want to address those concerns, but unfortunately, because of that possibility, it's probably better not to say anything at all. And again, to encourage them to make sure that their comments are added to the record, because that's ultimately what can be considered.
So this is our reminder moment to tell people there is a point for you to follow through on developments or rezonings or anything that you feel very strongly. And it is very important at what point in this process you get involved. What would be your advice, more practical advice now, on how do they make sure then I am informed and I'm getting involved at the right time? And also, if I'm trying to make sure that I'm taking emotions out and comparing to this comprehensive plan, where in the world do I find that?
Sure. So the comprehensive plan is available on the Planning and Design website. So if you go to louisvilleky.gov, click on departments, then one of the options is Planning and Design. And so we have a tab there for the comprehensive plan. Ideally, I would recommend that someone contact the case manager, which again is listed on the neighborhood notice, on the application notice, on any notices that they receive. That case manager is going to be listed on there. I would encourage them to contact the case manager, ask for a copy of either the pre-application staff report or the staff report, depending on where it is in the process, and then that will have the actual checklist that we're reviewing against for that particular case. And then again, we can go over the staff report and answer any questions they have about that. We can point to sections in the comp plan if they wish. I mean, that's one of the main functions of the case manager, especially at that point, is to help answer any questions that people may have about the application and then the process that it's going through.
I feel like we just loaded people with so much practical information, which is good because that's been our goal all along. Is there anything we're missing in this process or is critically important to highlight at this point?
Yeah, I'd like to just say a couple of things. Mm-hmm. First of all, we hear a lot from folks in the community and neighbors that feel like they are not represented, right? That they don't have a voice in this process. It's funny, if you go meet with the development community, you hear the opposite, right? They'll often tell you, oh my gosh, there's so much deference given to neighbors that it makes it really difficult to develop. I'm somewhat of the belief that when you have both sides of an issue feel like they're not getting their fair share, that you're probably in the right spot, right? That people are probably actually sort of fairly have their voice at the table. Again, with the understanding that, as these developments move forward, it is not the Planning Commission's decision. It's really not even Metro Council's decision. Is this a good idea or not, right? The decision really focuses on, is this compliant with the law or not? And so, I know that people get frustrated when, for example, we have had lots of growth in apartments in Jefferson County over the last few years, right? And people say, my gosh, why are they building more apartments? Why don't they build more single-family homes? Well, the developer is free to build whatever he or she thinks that they can sell, right? And if the market is demanding more rental units, then that is what developers are going to build. If the market demands more single-family housing, then that's what the developer is going to build if they want to be successful. So I do think, people should understand that they do have a voice in the process. That voice is listened to, even if it doesn't always feel that way. But again, the decisions are going to be made based on the comprehensive plan and compliance with that plan. And I think that's really the operative thing for people to remember. The last thing that I'll say is, somebody once said to me, the other thing that people should remember is that, every one of these subdivisions, every one of these apartments that people live in was also a field at one point. And so, the only way to really dictate what gets developed in a neighboring property is to own it, because the ownership rights of whoever owns that property, again, with the property rights in Kentucky, as long as they're compliant with the comprehensive plan, the benefit is going to go to them, right? And so the only way to truly prevent something from, to make sure that land stays fallow forever, would be for somebody to own it. But otherwise, someone could come along, build apartments, build a subdivision, or build nothing at all.
I know this is something that year in and year out is always always a phone call to every single one of these districts. It's always a topic that comes up. Let's go ahead and take this minute to just review this year. That's loaded. I understand. That's a loaded question. But we've now been doing a podcast, which is new for Metro Council, for a full year. This is the final episode of the year. What are your takeaways from 2022, Councilman?
I think that, it's been an interesting year. Obviously, we just got through an election. We've got a new mayor coming in next month. I think that will present an opportunity to sort of look at the things that we're doing, identify ways for us to improve on the things that we're doing, and really find a new path forward. I think that, the last year, we've made lots of positive progress, and I know people are frustrated from the events of the last few years, and we certainly have, long way to go and lots of significant challenges, whether it's with our homeless crisis or public safety challenges. But I do think it's important to note that we are making progress. We've got, downtown, our tourism numbers exceed our 2019 levels. We have lots of great developments coming into the area. We have made significant investments. We were aided certainly by the American Rescue Plan, but there are lots of exciting things coming to the city of Louisville, and really to the region. I mean, when you look at the investments Ford's making both at the Kentucky truck plant, they recently announced almost $800 million investment there, the multiple billion-dollar battery plant that's being built in Glendale, UPS is making hundreds of millions of dollars investments, and those are just sort of the top three. I mean, there are hundreds of additional investments that are being made across our community, really helping us build a resilient workforce. And I'm optimistic that 2023 is going to bring even better things, and really looking forward to the next year and continued growth for our city.
I think that's a wonderful positive note to end on. And hopefully much more planning and zoning and development to come in 2023.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, like you mentioned, we're still kind of trying to get caught up from what didn't happen in 2020 and 2021. And so I think you're going to see a continuation of catching up there, but then also dealing with some of the major projects that we've seen because it's very much a ripple effect. When you hear about these factory expansions or new factories coming, it doesn't just impact that community right there. You have to look at the secondary factories that may be providing supplies to those factories, and then people who want to commute a little further or may live somewhere else. And so, I think we're going to see definitely an impact from all of these changes in 2023.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that several of us are focused on, in the spirit of planning and zoning, is really identifying ways to promote infill development going forward. Sort of the difference between infill and greenfield development is just like it sounds. You've got a greenfield, right? It's typically what you're going to consider your suburban development. Nothing's been built there before, and that's greenfield development. Infill development is where you're taking an area that's already once been developed and changing the use. So you might think of, revitalization of an area as an example. Well, the benefit of infill development to the citizens of Jefferson County is that your infrastructure already exists there. Your roads are there, your sewers there, your utilities are there. And so the cost to society of redeveloping an area are much lower than when you have sprawl, because in sprawl, you got to build new schools, TARC has to drive further, you've got to build new sewage treatment plants, all of those things. So infill development for us is beneficial. Now, for a developer, it's the opposite, because it's much easier to if you want to build a subdivision and you've got, a flat square piece of property, you can lay out exactly where you want utilities to go. You can lay out exactly where you want the roads to go. That's much harder if your piece of property already has something on it and you'd have to move those things. And so part of what we want to do is identify, how can we help bring those two things into better balance so that we're promoting more development in our urban core. I think that's also important as we look at particularly downtown as an example, which is key to our workforce development and talent attraction, right? Young people want to live in a city that has a vibrant downtown. And while our tourism numbers have been really rebounded well and been doing great, we also recognize that we need a residential core, because as people have started to work differently and you no longer have 75,000 people commuting into downtown to work every day, you've got to have another group of people that are filling out those folks that are missing. And I think the key to that is downtown, residential, and I think you're going to see a lot of focus of that in 2023. There's a number of projects that are actually already in the hopper. I think more to come. The University of Louisville is building a research university downtown. I think you start to bring those things together. And there's some really exciting opportunities to create that residential core that brings vibrancy to the city. And I'll just close by saying that, it's the reason that downtown and a strong central business district is important to all of us, whether you live in the far east, the far south, or wherever, is because you can't be a suburb of nowhere, right? And you need to have a strong and vibrant Louisville to have a strong and vibrant J-Town or Middletown or Prospect or wherever else. And that's why I think it's critically important, and I'm optimistic that we're going to make progress on that next year.
A lot to look forward to in 2023. Well, thank you both so much for joining me for this episode, and really appreciate both of y'all's time. And if anyone has any questions, as always, get involved in the conversation. Comment on this podcast episode online. Send in a note to Councilman Winkler. I'm sure you'll love those. But get involved in the process. That's been our message the entire way, this entire year, of no matter what the topic is, there's a point in there for you to have your voice heard. So get involved. So thank you again so much for being here.
Thank you.